So right now we're going to talk about, one of the toughest questions we get from buyers, which is what price should they be offering when they're bidding on a home that's receiving multiple offers. Now, of course, we talked about that one of the most important things that we need to look at is, of course, our comparative market analysis, so we know the right value range when we're bidding on a particular home. But when we're sort of preparing for our offer night, there's usually, the approach that we like to take is usually mentally preparing to have 3 actual offers prepared. The first offer is sort of our low offer, which assumes that there's no one else bidding. I mean, in a competitive market, sometimes this feels like it's impossible to happen, but as the market eventually starts to cool down, we're going to see situations where properties have offer nights but are not getting multiple offers. So we want to be prepared for that situation. Then, well, what are we offering if there's no one else bidding? Our second offer is a situation where it's competitive but not overly competitive. Perhaps there's only 1 or 2 or maybe 3 other bidders. What price would we want to offer in that scenario? And then our final price is, of course, well, what if it's a very competitive bidding war? What if there's 5 or 6 or 10 other people? What is the max price that we're willing to pay? Now, when we think about sort of what offer to make and sort of the odds and the probability of winning a bidding war, the odds of winning a bidding war really come down to kind of largely 3 factors. And the first is, of course, what price we're offering. But the second important one is how many other people are bidding. I mean, the more competitive it is, of course, the less likely we are to get it if our offer is not strong enough. And then the last factor that's important, and we'll talk about at the very end, is sort of the dynamics and the mood and the sentiment of the market. There are these phases in the market that are very competitive, where there's a lot of fear of missing out, and there are periods when buyers are more conservative, and understanding these dynamics should and could influence what you need to pay on the particular home that you're bidding on. So when we think about bidding on a particular property, we're going to use a simple example again of a home that's listed for $799, but after doing our value range, we think the market value is between $960,000 and $1 million. So when we think about what offer to make and what are our odds of success, well, I mean, if we offer $960,000 and there are no other bidders, we might stand a chance of getting it because there's really nobody else at the negotiating table. Perhaps the seller is eager and desperate and anxious and just wants to sell. So even though we're at the low end of the value range, if there's no one else that we're competing with, we might stand a chance of getting it. Now, if we offered $960,000 and there were 2 or 3 other bidders, our probability of success goes down from maybe 50% to maybe 20%, because obviously we have more people bidding at the table. And then if we have 10 people bidding, I mean, our likelihood of winning it at $960,000 basically goes to 0. So this is an example of how our price is really a function of how many offers there are on the table. Now, if we think about, well, what about a situation when there are maybe only 2 or 3 other bidders on the property? Well, in that case, we might stand a somewhat reasonable chance of getting it if we're offering $980,000, which is right in the middle of the value range. And of course, the higher we're willing to offer, the higher our probability and likelihood of successes, even with only 2 or 3 bidders. So if we say at $980,000 with 2 or 3 other bidders, we have maybe a 50% chance of success. Well, if we go to $1 million, maybe our odds of success goes to 75% or 80% because we're at the very high end of the value range, and there are only 2 or 3 other people we're competing against. And usually with only 2 or 3 other people, one of them is probably not going to be realistic, so we're actually only maybe competing with actually 1 other person. Now, our last scenario, of course, well, what happens if there are 6 or 7 or 8 bidders, right? Well, an offer of $980,000 is probably not going to stand a very good chance. We probably need to be very close to this $1 million range, and possibly even a little bit higher if it's a very competitive offer night. Now, again, what the max price is of course, determined by the purchaser who's making it. Perhaps our client doesn't want to offer quite that high. The home's not worth it to them, and that's fine. but this is the range that we would expect the property to sell for on the offer night if they had, a ton of offers and it was a very competitive bidding war process. So in that situation, our max price potentially might be $1 million or perhaps slightly more than that. Now, one question I often get is, well, should we be just going in with our max price in a situation where, there are tons of offers? Shouldn't we keeping a little bit of money back in case the seller gives us a chance to improve our offer? Now, in a situation like this, if there are, 10 bids and we're offering $1 million, I probably would not recommend going in lower because for starters, we're not really offering above market value. I mean, we're making a reasonable price to begin with. We don't always know as purchasers if we're going to get a chance to improve our offers. And even if we are, we can just stay at the price we're at. We don't want to be losing the home for a price that we're willing to pay. Now, the one scenario that perhaps we would hold back a little bit is if I had a client, for example, who said my max price is $1,040,000. I'm willing to pay $40,000 more than what you think the high end of market value is because I really, really want this property. Well, in a situation like that, especially if there's maybe only 2 or 3 other offers, we might not feel like we need to go that aggressively. We would maybe go in at $1,010,000 or $1,015,000, to try to sort of save a little bit of money if we feel like we don't need to go that aggressively. So that would probably be the one situation where maybe we would hold back a little bit if we're actually bidding above the market value of the home because we don't want to really bid more than what we need to. I hope that makes sense. Now, the last sort of consideration that I really want to talk about, and it's a difficult one to kind of communicate, is really what I talked about earlier, which is the sentiment and the sort of the mood of the market. And this really happens and it can swing. We have periods where buyers are very aggressive, they bid aggressively. And there are periods where offer nights are not as aggressive, where things slow down, where buyers start to have more options. And these are situations where we find many times that we're actually advising our own buyers to not offer as aggressively as they think they need to offer because we don't think the offer night is going to be as competitive. And again, this is just because we're on the ground, we look at tons of houses, we see what other homes are selling for, we see how aggressively other buyers are bidding, and sometimes when the mood of the market shifts and it's not as an aggressive period, we kind of pull back a little bit and try to save some money and not have to bid as aggressively. Now, as agents, of course, it's very challenging sometimes to tell our clients to pay less because if they lose it for a price that they were willing to pay, obviously that's not a great feeling. And sometimes our clients take our advice and they win, and sometimes they don't take our advice because they said, I don't want to risk it. It's not worth saving $10,000. I really want this price and really want this home. And they'll still bid slightly aggressively. Again, because our advice is really just based on our on-the-ground insights. Nobody knows what the other bids are, but more often than not, we have a good pulse for what's going on in the market. And I think that's one of the key differences, with agents who are full-time, who sell a lot of homes versus someone who does 2 or 3 homes, understanding these differences. A lot of times some of the mistakes agents make is that they come in aggressively and bid these ridiculous prices when the market has cooled because they were used to a market from 2 or 3 months ago that was overly competitive, and they don't realize that the market has cooled down. So understanding sort of these micro dynamics in the market, especially across different neighborhoods, is also an important consideration when thinking about what price to offer on the particular home that you're interested in.
I hope you found that buyer tip helpful. If you're buying a home in the Toronto area's very competitive housing market and want an edge, sign up for my free 1-hour webinar on the top 10 strategies that are going to give you that advantage. You're going to learn the number one thing that you need to know when deciding what price to offer on a home, why price alone is not the only factor that leads someone to win in a multiple offer situation, and how to find value in good homes that other buyers overlook. Click the link above or below to sign up now to give yourself that advantage in Toronto's housing market.